Here's my story. I was married to my wife for 7 years. I knew something was up after several times I had arrived home from work to find only my teenage daughter at home and my wife missing. She'd always tell me what her mom told her to tell me. An example would be that she went grocery shopping to see a woman friend from work, other kinds of shopping, or had to help somebody with something. My daughter never seemed like she was aware she was lying, which is good. I don't think my wife would have the nerve to burden our daughter with any secrets she kept from me. I was so annoyed that I decided to come home a little early for a few days. Each time, I sat in my car down the street to see if my wife left. On the third day, she left, and I followed her. She got to Bosco's, which gave me relief at first, because maybe she told the truth each time. But then I saw the man she was meeting at the entrance. He was tall, handsome, and rich-looking. He kissed my wife enthusiastically before they went inside. My wife's birthday was the next day, and I swore this seemed like some kind of birthday shopping spree when I wouldn't be suspicious of her absence. I went inside Boscov's and walked around close enough to see how they interacted. It was extremely romantic behavior. I started filming, and it took a few minutes for me to catch him grabbing her butt. I wanted to set the building on fire. I was so mad. I filmed for as long as I could, but then AP saw me staring at them. I left the building and got to my car, but before I drove away, I saw him come out with my wife's hand in his. She looked concerned and puzzled, trying to see who he was talking about. Hopefully, she was feeling panic like I was. I returned home and wondered what I should say to my daughter. She was 17, so kind of old enough to handle adult issues, but either way, it was going to be really upsetting. I told her I saw her mom with another man, so I was going to stay at Grandma's for a while. She asked if she could come with me because she'd been thinking about helping Grandma with her garden. I thought that was the cutest and most uplifting thing I could have heard at that moment. We packed some bags and left, no tears or worrying. Grandma was excited to see us, and I felt like it was all gonna be okay. My wife returned shortly after that to our empty house. I left her a note on the counter that I was the one watching them, and I had proof she was romantically involved with him. I told her to enjoy her birthday alone in an empty house because that's what she deserved. Unfortunately, the house was hers, so she was able to keep living there, but she couldn't have AP move in because he got arrested for doing some illegal things. I'm happy to report that my ex was heartbroken. She couldn't believe she betrayed the happy and secure family she built for a man that bought her things and stole stuff. She told me a lot of her honest thoughts on voicemail ramblings. She maintained a distant relationship with our daughter that took years to return to normal. I'm sad to say that she really started to hate the things about herself that reminded her of her mom. I told her she was her own person, mixed with two people's DNA and unique among anyone else. I told her she could only be in control of herself, her own decisions, and her emotions. I reminded her that letting hatred or bitterness simmer in your heart only makes that how you behave. I told her to start writing in a journal, and she said I was preaching, but I did notice her seeming more joyful and grateful a few days later. She gardened with Grandma and went to visit her mom sometimes. OP, I'm sorry your wife gave up the marriage you both had and betrayed her own daughter. She looked up to her mom for an example of how a good woman behaves. However, the advice you gave her was spot on, and I think your daughter learned how not to behave. Sometimes that kind of example is just as effective as a good example. It's lucky you're a wise father and was there to notice she needed a little father preaching to help her get through some issues and doubts that arose because of her mother's poor behavior. She must have been extremely shallow and materialistic to be tempted by a man on the notion of being spoiled. Take your time finding a better and more honest woman. I wish nothing but good fortune and luck to you, your daughter, and Grandma. Thank you for sharing your story. Now let's get into today's second story. After being married for 8 years, my wife and I were actually invited to my mom's house. She was married to the most horrible man in existence, my stepfather. They had an offspring from hell named Lester. Lester was already 20 by the time we were invited to their house. For the purpose of story flow, I'll sometimes refer to both of them as steps. When I was still living with them, Lester and I never spoke. It was like he saw the goodness in who I was and was allergic to it. All he ever did when we were younger was break stuff or get into trouble and then blame me. He had it out from me from the beginning, and I assumed it was because of who his father was. My stepfather never tried to develop a relationship with me. All he ever did was tell me he was in charge, and I needed to fear him. Since Lester was his little minion, he used him as an extension of himself. So it had been a very long time since I saw my own mother, and my wife of 8 years never met any of my family. On the way there, I warned her that my stepfather and stepbrother were the worst people you'd ever meet, and she shouldn't feel compelled or forced to communicate with them at all. She sincerely listened to my warning like the good girl she was. I wasn't worried at all about her being unable to handle a little social awkwardness or even some rude comments. She was a good wife, and for all I knew, my steps had changed for the better in the past decade. We arrived safely at their house, which looked exactly the same as when I left. The introductions were awkward. The steps both looked my wife up and down without hiding the fact that they were checking her out. They barely greeted me. My mom was the one attempting to have a normal social gathering. She brought dinner out on the table, where we all had to sit across from each other. The men stared at my wife like she was a television show. I asked them to stop staring at her, and that's when some yelling started. My stepdad said that I was the guest here, and he could look wherever he wanted. My stepbrother said she deserved better than me, but tried to lessen the magnitude of what he said because of my mother's reaction. I don't know how, but my mom recovered from this exchange smoothly. I think I just missed her a lot and longed for this visit to go smoothly and peacefully. Plus, I felt like my wife and I were safe. I certainly didn't expect what was going to happen late that night. I woke up in the middle of the night in my sleeping bag on the living room floor. My wife wasn't on the couch anymore. I looked around and checked the bathroom, but still couldn't find her. Now I was groggy and growingly concerned. I didn't like that she was missing, with my terrible steps in the same house. I decided to check my parents' bedroom very quietly, and I only saw my mom sleeping. I checked Lester's room a little less quietly and found the scene of a nightmare. My wife was having sex with my stepfather. I wish this was just a nightmare, but it was actually happening. My mom ran in to see what was wrong, and she saw everything too. She walked straight over to slap the hell out of my stepdad, repeatedly. He actually fell over. Then she ran off and slammed the door of the bathroom. I felt so horrible. My mother shouldn't have had to see it, but these bastards didn't even care. Then I looked at my wife and demanded to know why she did this. She just sat on the bed, covering her face. She started shaking like she was sobbing, and she looked up with her ugly cry face to mouth sorry to me. This didn't make any sense at all. The respectable and kind wife I knew was gone. I told my mom to come with me. We packed our stuff and went back to my house, leaving my cheating wife with the steps. My mom lived with me while we both filed for divorce. She was a wreck just as much as I was, but we actually did bond and have good times together, for the first time since I was really young. Before I knew it, she was making jokes about us going club hopping together. Prior to our first court date, my wife got a ride back to our neighborhood by paying for a long Uber drive. When she showed up at my door, I was very surprised and unhappy to see her. I told her I had nothing to say to her. She just needed to show up to court. She got on her knees and begged me to let her in. She just needed to get some of her stuff and figure out where to go. She hadn't been able to charge her phone for a while and told me that it wasn't long before the steps started treating her like a prisoner. I told her I would never understand why she agreed to go in that room and cheat on me. Then I slammed the door in her face and locked it. She would have no mercy or communication from me. In court, my mother got alimony from my stepfather and continued living in my house. I stayed with her for a while, but once the divorce was final, I let her rent my house cheap while I found a new place to call my home. I believed in keeping close to my mother, but not that close. I needed to be independent and remain an eligible bachelor if I was to find a woman of equal quality. I got settled into my house really well before allowing any women to come over. I never saw or heard from my ex. She failed to show up to court for our divorce. I never heard from the steps ever again, but I did find out that Lester was sent overseas in the army after his dad died in a construction work accident. It doesn't sound like a very happy life, and that's all I'll sum them up to. I'm happy with where I ended up after losing my wife of 8 years. I hope my story stops people from cheating because it causes mass destruction and pain. Hopefully more for the cheater than the victim, though. Wow, OP. I am sorry your wife chose to put herself in a situation that allowed for her to cheat on you. I'm not sure what she was thinking, but it's clear they were giving her attention, which indicates they thought she was attractive. Maybe she let this attention go to her head, and she simply didn't think about the consequences or how you'd feel knowing the truth of her actions. This is just really despicable to me, that she couldn't use a little self-control and modesty to avoid breaking your heart and ending her marriage. Who knows how long she would have tried to hide this from you if you didn't find out. My guess is a really long time, even if her behavior changed. I'm glad you didn't have any children with her, OP. I'm glad you have a second chance and got your mom out of a bad situation too. I wish you the best of luck going forward. Thank you all for taking the time to listen to today's stories. If you enjoyed listening, please feel free to like and subscribe if you haven't already. Also, comment below with your thoughts on what happened. If there is a story you would like to share, then please do not hesitate to contact me. Take care.